within like 2 months, I had like 7,000 of Gary Vee's followers. And then every time I commented on his post, I would be like the top comment with 100 likes. And then everybody would be like, who's this girl who's always the top comment on Gary Vee's posts? And I got a lot of following from that. And everybody at first used to know me from being like Gary Vee's like fan, that was like always the number one post. And I got a lot of attention like that.
This Audience Summit is brought to you in partnership with Podcast Notes, the best ideas from the world's best podcasts in minutes. Hala, welcome to the Grow Your Podcast Audience Summit brought to you by The Lewis and Kyle Show.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Real quick, before we get started with the questions, could you just briefly introduce yourself personally, talk a bit about your show, the when and why you started it, and what the overall mission is?
Sure. So my name is Hala Taha. I am the host of Young and Profiting Podcast. We're a top 50 education podcasts on Apple and the number one how-to podcast on Apple in multiple countries. And really, we're all about helping people improve their lives, both professionally and financially. And I interview a different guest each week. We're all about providing actionable advice. And some of our topics include how to improve your productivity, how to have effective time management, the art of entrepreneurship, and things like that. So it's a really great educational show, and I pour my heart and soul into it.
My first question for you, what has been the most effective marketing channel for growing the audience for your podcast, and how have you used it?
I really grew my following on LinkedIn. That's my number one platform. I have 67,000 followers on there now. When I first started podcasting, I had like 2,000. I only started my podcast about 2 years ago, so that's pretty significant growth over the past 2 years. I chose LinkedIn because I am targeting people who like self-improvement, and I felt like people on LinkedIn were all about bettering themselves. People liked educational content. In the beginning of my podcast journey, I was posting on Instagram and LinkedIn, and I noticed that nobody on Instagram really liked my stuff. A lot of people on Instagram, they like sexy, fun, flashy stuff. And on LinkedIn, they're more receptive to educational content. So that's where I really decided to focus everything on. I actually stopped posting on Instagram for over a year, just focusing on LinkedIn. And because I had some creative strategies in terms of how to grow my LinkedIn following, I was very proactive. I really stood out in the feed. I'm a marketer. And so I was able to really take advantage of my marketing skills and use that as a way to grow my podcast following. And happy to get into the details if you'd like.
Yeah, that's great. And that's certainly the first time that we've asked that question and someone has said that it was LinkedIn that they used to grow their following. So maybe this next question we'll get a good answer from you in terms of LinkedIn. But what are some underrated tactics that you've used to attract listeners to your show? Maybe that's how have you used LinkedIn in creative ways to produce an outsized return?
Yeah. So first of all, I was super proactive. When I first started on LinkedIn, like I said, I had like 2,000 followers. So the first thing I did was message every single follower with a link to my podcast and said, hey, I just launched a new podcast. I would love for you to check it out. And like a lot of podcasters, I saw like a big uptick in my downloads, like my first couple of episodes, because when your podcast is new and hot, all your friends will check it out and your family members will check it out. And then things start to like slow down. So when things started to slow down and I felt like my initial buzz was gone, because I was like the president of my alumni association and all these things. So it's like I had a lot of communities to promote my podcast in initially. That's when I started just like hitting the streets. So what hitting the streets on LinkedIn, so to say. So Gary Vee is like a big podcaster and influencer. And so he had a big following on LinkedIn. So I actually targeted his following. And anybody who liked and commented on his posts, so those people were actually active on LinkedIn. There's plenty of people who hop on LinkedIn, they get a job, they never come back on again. I wanted the active people. So anybody who liked and commented on his posts, I invited to connect. And I said like, hey, what's up? I'm Hala. If you like Gary Vee's content and podcast, you're going to like mine too. I'd love to connect, provide value on your feed. And I would invite them to connect one by one. Within like 3 months, and I had my team helping me and I used some automation tools. And within like 2 months, I had like 7,000 of Gary Vee's followers. And then every time I commented on his post, I would be like the top comment with 100 likes. And then everybody would be like, who's this girl who's always the top comment on Gary Vee's posts? And I got a lot of following from that. And everybody at first used to know me from being like Gary Vee's like fan, that was like always the number one post. And I got a lot of attention like that. The other way that I stood out on LinkedIn was just like super bright colors. Like my brand is really young, fresh. LinkedIn is, everybody posts like the same thing. It's a little bit stale, especially 2 years ago. Everybody used to post like the same audiograms. I did like a comic book style audiogram that nobody had ever done before. And I turned everybody into cartoons for my podcast because I didn't do video at that point. I used super bold patterns, colors, and just really good content. Like I really was great at copywriting and leveraged that in order to promote my podcast. People tend to forget that, your podcast, if you're just doing audio, you need a visual element to promote it. So whether that's chopping it up into videos or creating audiograms or graphics, whatever it is, you need a visual component to actually promote it on social media. And I would say my graphics and videos are really top notch. And that's actually why I started my podcast marketing agency, because so many people approached me because my marketing was so good.
Wow, those
Yeah.
are a lot of creative strategies that we have not heard before. So we really appreciate you sharing those. That's an extremely kind of just creative way of approaching it. So you definitely
I
lived up
have
to the
some.
hype there.
Yeah, I have another really good one that probably nobody has said yet
Let's
because
hear
I think
it.
I'm the only one doing it. So now that I have a decent following, one of the ways that I'm growing my following is partnering with different podcast apps. And so, like every week, I'm emailing 10 different podcast apps. I'm telling them about my show, who we've had on, like Robert Greene, Mark Manson, how many downloads we get a month. And I say like, hey, like I'll do a podcast read for you, or I'll do a LinkedIn post for you in exchange for you putting me on your paid ad spot in your app, or in exchange for you guys featuring me on your homepage, or in exchange for you guys writing a blog about me, whatever it is. So I'm just trading my communities with other podcast apps to try to get more visibility within those apps. So I think that that's another underrated strategy that I would say like middle to big podcasters can use to grow their following. And all the podcast apps say I'm the only one doing this. So that's a real big secret right there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think when we get to that point, that's definitely something to think about. All right, so third question for you. Once you've gotten a lot of attention and a couple of thousand followers on these different platforms, what do you think you've done that have converted some of these listeners really into more passionate fans? And how have you kept the same people coming back?
I think a lot of it has to do with consistency. So, consistency and quality. So, they know that every day I'm going to post something on LinkedIn that's educational, no matter if they go listen to the podcast or not. They also know that every Monday I'm going to put out an exceptional episode. I do 10, 20 hours of research per show. I have an entire research team now. We really do our due diligence to have a show that is packed with information that you won't find anywhere else. And it's just always an energetic, educational show. And it never fails. You know what I mean? Nobody ever will listen to Yap and be disappointed. I think if you liked it the first time, the next time you hear it, you're not going to be disappointed because we always make sure that the quality is there. I think a lot of podcasters, they just throw anything up. There's been interviews I haven't put out because I'm all about quality control. We're super selective with our guests. We want to make sure that it's just a topic that works for everyone. We never do pay for play. Like nobody can ever just like pay me to come on my podcast. There's lots of other podcasters that like sometimes you'll get a shit episode because they're just like promoting someone's business and they get paid to put them on. So there's always quality and there's like some quality assurance that I guarantee. The other thing is that I'm available. When people are on LinkedIn and they're my fans, if they reach out to me, they ask me a question, I answer, or my team answers on behalf of me. And in the beginning, it was definitely me, and I grew those listeners one by one. I also started a Slack community of listeners when I first started. When we first started, we didn't have a ton of listeners, but they were super, super into the podcast, like obsessed with the podcast. And I even had a lot of people on my team right now. I have 27 people on my team. They were all in the beginning, like 10 people reached out to me. They were listeners who just wanted to volunteer for my podcast because they were just so obsessed with the podcast. And so we started this Slack community of super fans, and I don't really use it anymore. It doesn't really exist anymore. But like for the first 6 months of my podcast, that's how I got in touch with like my super fans, and I would have them vote on episode titles, and they would vote on upcoming guests that they wanted us to reach out to. They would share their own personal stories, ask me anything in this chat. And that was a way for me to like nurture these 300 people that really liked the podcast when I didn't really have many podcast fans yet. And then I would share my LinkedIn posts and they would like them and share them. And those were like my quote unquote super fans that really helped me grow the brand initially. And just doing stuff like that, like making people feel part of a community is really important.
Sounds like you really intentionally cultivated, those super fans and got to the point where you had your 1,000 true fans and were able to leverage that into where you're at today. So that's really good. So our fourth question for you is, if you could start your show over again, what would you do differently now to grow it more effectively?
I love this question. It's a great question. I would have changed the name of my podcast. So my podcast is called Young and Profiting, and YAP is the initial. So from a marketing perspective, I think my podcast name is pretty cool. Like nobody else had the name Young and Profiting before me. It kind of sounds like it should be something that people have used in the past. And so when I realized that nobody has used Young and Profiting for a brand, I was really surprised initially that it wasn't taken. But looking back now, I wish I had a keyword in my name. So I have a friend, his name is Brian Ford. I think you interviewed him actually, and he's got a podcast called Self Improvement Daily. And because he's got this keyword self improvement, he's very easily searched in the apps. And so when he first started, even though, for example, like I have a much bigger social media following than him, he was getting way more downloads than me. And it was because he had self improvement keyword in his title. And so he would pop up when somebody would look up self improvement in the podcast app. Whereas nobody's really searching for young and profiting naturally if they've never heard of me. So now I have great downloads and stuff, but it was because I had to spoon feed it to everyone and like really get my brand visible out there. Whereas if you have a keyword in your name, I think it's much easier to grow organically. So that's what I would have done different.
That's very interesting. And yeah, Brian shared that and it kind of blew our minds when he came on the summit and was like, people just find me. He's like the only person in the whole summit who
It's
like it's
so
organic.
crazy. It's so crazy. He has such a different like I I'm so jealous of his name of his podcast because he gets so many downloads and he only does 2 minutes a day. It's such a different format. And because he does 2 minutes a day, he gets a lot of downloads because it's like people are downloading it every single day. He probably gets people really getting into the habit of listening to his show because it's every day for 2 minutes. So I think people are incorporating in their morning routine. So I think what he did is like genius and what a great strategy.
Yeah, and then even the autoplay, because his completion rates are so high. I mean, there's just so many ways that the format he's chosen has really played to his advantage.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's tough. I think there's only so many like, 2-minute podcasts that are going to be successful. I think he just like really lucked out. So, and he's a great host too. He's charismatic.
Absolutely. The last question we have for you. I know you have a marketing background, so it's interesting to see what you'll do with the money. But we've been offering a hypothetical free gift of $1,000 to our podcast hosts participating in the summit to do some creative marketing campaign to attract listeners to their show. So if we gave you that money, how would you spend it?
I would hire a video editor from the Philippines for 1 month and the rates of work in other countries like the Philippines and India is much less than America. And so $1,000 is actually a very good salary. And I would hire a video editor slash graphic designer in India or the Philippines. And I would send them all of my content that I've recorded so far and ask them to create videos for me that I would use on social media. And if you had somebody working full time for you for a month, working on graphics and videos, you could produce a whole shit ton of content. So that's what I would do.
I love that. Clip as much as you possibly can. Well,
Yeah.
Hala, thank you very much for coming on and speaking with us and sharing some of your insights that you've learned from growing your podcast. If our listeners have enjoyed your answers and are interested to check out your podcast or your LinkedIn, where should we send them?
Yeah, so Young and Profiting is on Apple, we're on Spotify, we're on Castbox. Anywhere that you like to listen to your podcast, you're going to find Young and Profiting. My name is Hala Taha. You can find me on LinkedIn, just search for my name. And I'm on Instagram at Yap with Hala. So would love to connect with everyone on there. And just let me know you found me on the Luis and Kyle show.
There you go. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching this interview. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe to our channel right here on YouTube. And if you feel like you learned something, share this episode on social media to help us grow our audience as well.